Welcome to Monday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us for week number 9 of our series, The New and Living Way, all part of the Navigating the New course that we're on for this year. We left off last week, the end of last week, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, and we were talking about the story of Peter and Jesus walking on the water. And of course, how Peter actually walked on the water and he began to sink and Jesus saved him. But I want to start this week over in the Gospel of John, chapter 6. This is the same story here. Now, he doesn't record the account of Peter walking on the water, but he does talk about Jesus walking on the water. And I began to, when I was thinking about this between services right before my Sunday service, which I ministered this on this past Sunday, I began to see something in this story I'd never really seen before. And when you begin to start comparing the Old Covenant with the New Covenant, all of a sudden you start seeing that that's a large part of what the Gospels are trying to get across to us, particularly the Gospel of John, because he begins even the comparison in John chapter 1, verses 16, 17. He said, where the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So he's already comparing and making the distinction between the old covenant of law given by Moses and the new covenant of grace that Jesus initiated. Now, again, what we want to emphasize here is that the fact that there's nothing wrong with the law itself. You know, God is not against the law. He gave the law. And those are all indicative or descriptive of His standard of righteousness. The problem with the law was we could not keep the law. And it really pointed to us and made a demand on mankind in order to keep the law. When I say keep the law, it's not just a little smorgasbord where you pick and choose and do the best you can, and I tried. You got to keep it 100% perfectly. And of course, none of us, mankind, could not keep that law. It actually did two things. It actually pointed to Jesus, who would come, who would fulfill the covenant for us. God didn't do away with the law. Jesus fulfilled it for all of us, for all mankind, for all time. But the law all pointed to Jesus. It all painted a picture of Him coming. But also, it really put the spotlight on us and our inability to save ourselves, our inability to produce the kind of righteousness that God demands and requires. And God never intended for mankind to keep the law in order to become righteous or become in right standing with Him. That was all, again, pointing to Jesus. Jesus was the way. He was the truth, the life. He was the only one who actually could keep and fulfill the law. And of course, He passed that on to all of us by identification. So we've been talking about for this whole entire series the distinction, the differences between the old and the new. And this is not Pastor Tony talking here. This is God Himself talking over in Hebrews, that the new covenant is a new and better covenant established on better promises. It, of course, had a better sacrifice than the old system did, the old covenant of law did. In fact, it's not just a better one, it's a perfect one. And Jesus is that perfect sacrifice, and He had that perfect blood that was shed for all of us. And it produced a better hope of accessing the presence of God. And you see words like confidence and assurance and surety and surely and sure, and all those kind of words right there is all pointing to the new covenant. And why would we want to go back to try to mix in the old with the new if the old was inferior in every way and the new is superior in every way in Christ? Well, again, you begin to see these kind of differences that the New Testament writers and the Gospel writers begin to bring out here. And this is one of them. So I want to go to John chapter 6, and we're going to begin reading in verse number 16. Again, this is same story we read last week in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, but it says in verse 16, "Now when evening had come," or Matthew 14, excuse me, this is verse 16, Now when evening had come, his disciples went down to the sea and got into the boat and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because of a great wind that was blowing. And so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, I tell you, that's a lot of rowing right there. And the reason that they were rowing is because they couldn't put the sail up and use the wind as a tailwind, as something that would drive them across. They actually had a headwind blowing against them, and in order to get across to the other side, they were going to have to row it. In other words, rowing is a lot harder than the wind getting in the, on the back of you and hitting your sail and then pushing you across. So they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, and they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were afraid. I want you to see the picture right here. They were out there rowing for a long time. Jesus was up in the mountain fellowshipping with his Father, and they were out there rowing this whole time, rowing and not going. We can say it that way. They were just rowing hard and really not making much headwind with this thing, headway. And so Jesus actually caught up to them while he was walking on the water. So we see that Jesus had a whole different transportation system, a supernatural transportation system they had. Now, this is kind of descriptive of mankind. All of us were trying to, under the law, trying to produce our own righteousness with God. And there was a lot of rowing, but not a whole lot of going. We just weren't going anywhere. We were rowing, working hard, sweating, toiling, and we just weren't getting anywhere. But Jesus comes along. See, before that, they were rowing and not going without Jesus. But then all of a sudden, Jesus appears. And thank God that Jesus came for us. What we could not do, Jesus did for us. And so in verse 20 it says, and he said to them, it is I. Actually, the correct rendering there should be I am. Do not be afraid. Verse 21, then they willingly received him into the boat. Well, I guess so, because they had gone a long way. They had rowed a hardcore going across that lake with a headwind, not going anywhere. Jesus comes walking on the water. Of course, Peter in his story about walking on the water is inserted there. We read that last week. But then when Jesus appeared, he said, don't be afraid. I'm here, okay? Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. I want you to see the difference that Jesus makes when he gets into your boat. When you put Jesus into your equation, when you put Jesus into your life, when you exercise your faith and trust in Jesus for righteousness, for salvation, I want you to see that he gets it done with him being in the boat where you and all your hard work just could not get it done. And I'll tell you, that is a perfect description right there between the old and the new. Under the old, we were rowing, working hard, toiling, sweating, and not really getting anywhere. But then Jesus comes on the scene. Thank God, Jesus comes on the scene. He not only comes on the scene, but he gets in our boat with us. Now, did Jesus need to ride in that boat? Well, apparently not, because he had made it all that way, 3 or 4 miles. He had walked on the water without a boat. Okay, so Jesus didn't need the boat for himself, but we needed Jesus in our boat in order to get us to the other side. Jesus completely identified with mankind in our fallen, work and toil-stricken condition of not going anywhere. And what we could not do, Jesus did for us. Immediately, they were at the other side. I always like to say, I like to see the rooster tail in the back of that boat as it was skimming across that water. Immediately, they were at the other side. That Jesus takes us where everybody else is trying to work, toil, and sweat to get to. Jesus takes us there by his grace when we exercise faith in him. There's another story kind of along that line. It's found in Luke chapter 5, and I'll just kind of recount this to you. We've looked at it a number of times over different lessons and different series, but it's the story of Peter and his fishing company who had gone out into the lake one night and had fished and toiled all night and caught nothing. And the next day they had pulled everything in, and they were washing their nets, folding them up, getting ready to put them away for the day, and then they're going to try again the next night, I guess. But Jesus comes along, and he was teaching the great multitudes that were following along. The multitude got so great that Jesus had to get into the boat, and he just, he borrowed Peter's boat and just launched out just a little bit from the shore to keep them from just, crowding him out so bad, and he began to teach them from that boat. But when he got done, he told Peter, instructed Peter, he said, you're never going to get Jesus involved in your life and him not bring a blessing into your life, I can tell you. So Jesus tells Peter at this point, he says, launch out into the deep for a catch. Now, notice he didn't say, go out there and try to go fishing again and see if you can catch something now. No, Jesus said, launch out into the deep for a catch. Now, actually, the word catch is the word haul. Now, when you say haul, that's a lot different than just catching a couple of little fish out of the lake and then going home and having dinner for yourself. This was their livelihood. We have to remember this, that at this point in time, Peter, James, and John made a livelihood out of fishing. They had a fishing business, a fishing company. And of course, Jesus is concerned about our daily life and provision. And so he tells them to launch out into the deep for a catch. Well, they had already cleaned their nets and folded them up, put them away, but, and Peter kind of briefly hesitated with this. And he just said, Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. What does that tell us? Same thing that was going on here, John chapter 6. He was doing a lot of hard work, a lot of toiling, a lot of sweating, but not having any fruit or any production out of it. In fact, he said they caught nothing. He didn't say that they just caught a little bit. He said they caught nothing. No thing. And so, but he said, nevertheless, at your word, we'll cast out the net. Now, that's not what Jesus told him. Jesus told him to go cast out the nets, plural, because there was going to be a haul of fish coming in. Peter was going to halfway try this. At least he went out there, okay? At least he took Jesus at his word, went back out there, and threw out one net. I mean, if he had just sat there and said, I don't believe that, and he would have been shut down. He wouldn't have caught anything. He would have gone home empty-handed that day. But he went out and he said, I'm going to cast out the net. So one boat, he took his boat out there and cast out one net. Well, when he did that, all the fish in that lake tried to crowd into. They hit that net and they tried to crowd right into it all at one time. And they were breaking the net. They were cramming in there so hard. And so they began to fill up that boat, and then they had to get the other partners to come out there, his other partners in the fishing business, to come out there, bring their boats, their nets, and they caught so many fish that day that it was sinking all of their boats. That was a haul of fish. Now listen, these people are in the fishing business. They were professional fishermen, and they had seen probably good catches of fish before, but they knew this was different than any other one before. This was a haul of fish that was supernatural. It was not at night when they normally catch fish. It was during the day, probably midday, at least favorable time to catch fish. And yet they had so many that so many fish, it was just loading the boats down. They could, and the fish didn't stop until they ran out of capacity to receive. I want you to see that God is an ever-ending supply for us. And it's through Jesus that we get this supply. Whereas the law created demanded from us all the time, Jesus in His grace supply is constantly giving and constantly supplying. And so when Peter got back with those boats full of fish, he said, depart from me, I am a sinful man, O Lord. So what was on his mind right there? Well, he had his mind on himself, the spotlight on himself. The law does that. It makes a demand on you. And it showed him that he was not worthy of such a haul and such a catch of fish. But he caught it anyway. In other words, he said, this is just too good and too gracious for me. But you know what? That's what Jesus came to do. Now, Jesus didn't take it back and say, all right, I didn't know that. Throw those fish back out. I really didn't realize how full of sin you were, Peter. He knew exactly Peter's condition. But Jesus, through his grace, supplied more than enough in spite of Peter, not because of Peter. And he does the same thing for us, not because of us and our good works, but in spite of us, out of his grace. And again, that shows us right there the difference between man's work, toil, and sweat not producing anything, and Jesus' grace supply bringing everything good to us in this new and better covenant that we're talking about. Again, the old demanded, and we worked and toiled and didn't get anywhere. Rowing, not going, fishing, not catching. But under the new covenant of grace, God supplies through Jesus more than enough. Even though we're sinful, the grace of God overcomes that. And listen, he didn't leave us in our sinful condition. He changes us on the inside and makes us righteous. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. That's a good place to stop and a good place to start this week out. If you'd like additional materials, go to tonycowan.org. We'll see you tomorrow.